This is Crimea. Over its history, it has swapped hands many times, from Scythians to Greeks to Bulgars to Goths to Huns. Blah-de-blah. You get the point. By 1774, during one of the many Russo-Turkish wars, it was owned by the Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. After this war, it was agreed to leave the Khanate alone, but as the Ottomans declined, the Russians eventually went ahead and annexed it. Mine! And it stayed like that all the way up to 1917. And then, you guessed it, Russian Civil War time! During the unmitigated mess that was the Russian Civil War, Crimea was also a mess in that it was briefly independent until it tried to become a Soviet republic, but that didn't really work, and they ended up being annexed by Ukraine, but they didn't really like that, so they declared independence again until the Reds showed up and made them a Soviet republic. But then, 180-degree turn, they joined the Whites until the Whites eventually lost, and then they became part of the Russian SFSR. And it stayed with Russia until 1954, until Khrushchev transferred it back to Ukraine. Now, if you want to be wholesome, some people might say that Khrushchev did this because he genuinely liked Ukraine, and that it also marked the 300th anniversary of the annexation of Ukraine by the Russian Empire. However, if you believe his actions were much more cynical, then it is possible that he did so to put more ethnic Russians within Ukraine to dilute nationalist sentiment and keep them under control, as he had done similar things with Poland, Estonia, Azerbaijan, and so on and so forth. There's also the fact that it was practically worthless, since Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union at this time. Now, if we fast forward a few decades, you will notice that there is a severe lack of Soviet Union on this map. And what do you know? Ukraine still owns Crimea. Meanwhile, the former head state of the Soviet Union, Russia, they're not exactly having what you would call a good time, mostly thanks to a certain Boris Yeltsin. After some hardline communists attempted and failed to commit a coup, the Union disbanded. And it was replaced by the Russian Federation, with its leader, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had big ideas for Russia. He viewed communism as a system that had failed Russia.
Failure! Failure! You're still a failure! Failure! I can smell the failure!
And thus wanted to transition to a capitalist economy as quickly as possible in what would become known as shock therapy. It was thought that it would be very difficult for 6 months, but afterwards everything would calm down, and Russia would begin to prosper. Or so it was thought. What happened immediately was a massive spike in inflation. Then price controls went. And what immediately followed, as you might guess, was a massive spike in the price of goods, while wages didn't go up at all, meaning the average person couldn't really afford anything. The other thing that had to happen was selling off most of the government-owned businesses to individual shareholders. To do so, the government gave each citizen a 10,000 ruble voucher to buy up some of the shares of whatever company they work for. However, due to sky-high inflation, the voucher was worth something more in the range of £28.50, or $35 in Yankee money. What happened as a result is that a number of wealthy people decided to buy up all the vouchers for a bit more than the original price, then turn around and buy the whole plant. Gimme that. And then they thought, say, that was fairly cheap, and now I own an entire factory. What if I... Oh, snap. And then what followed was that these people would buy up one business, then another, then another, until what happens is that there are now 10 people practically in charge of the whole Russian economy. This is what is known as the Russian oligarchy. Another way in which they got rich was by subscribing to this channel. Subscribe or I'll buy you. Wait, what? Furthermore, they went ahead and put all their newfound wealth in Swiss banks, meaning it could not be used for the benefit of the Russian economy. Since it was Yeltsin's policy that led to this, as you can imagine, this didn't make him particularly popular. So when Yeltsin, who was still under the belief that his economic reforms would work long-term, came to Parliament with a new list of reforms he wanted, their conversation went a bit like this. Nah. Come on. Nah. Come on. Nah. Come on. Nah. Come on. In the end, they did come to an agreement. Yeltsin can have his reforms, but he must get 50% of the entire Russian population to vote in favor, not just 50% support in a poll. If you don't yet realize, this means it's practically impossible for him to win at all. There's not a chance he would be able to convince half of all of this to vote at all, let alone for this. In the end, he did actually manage to get a majority of voters on his side, but the majority of Russians simply did not vote. Nevertheless, he took this as a victory. Now he just had to ask the parliament to implement his reforms. Implement my reforms. Nah. On Workers' Day, 1st of May, 1933, members of various communist parties in St. Petersburg came together to protest Yeltsin and demand his removal, causing mass brawls between protesters and police, with one officer being killed. In June 1933, Yeltsin and the Supreme Soviet had one last attempt to reconcile their differences by meeting up to discuss a new constitution. Well, there is my proposal for a constitution, and there is mine. These are entirely contradictory. This means war. Yeltsin's first act was to fire the vice president, Alexander Rotosky, who had opposed him in the past, falsely accusing him of corruption. The problem was, according to the constitution at the time, that's illegal. So the parliament tried to impeach him over this. But Yeltsin, in an absolutely fantastic move, went on TV on the 21st of September and announced he was firing the entire Supreme Soviet and declared that it no longer exists. Now, believe it or not, by law, he wasn't actually allowed to do this. So in retaliation, the parliament declared that Yeltsin was no longer president, and instead made the vice president that Yeltsin just fired president. At this time, Russia now had two governments, both recognizing each other as illegitimate, so it comes as no surprise that what followed was known as a mini-civil war. What happened next is that pro-parliament citizens began to gather outside the parliament building to defend it, while pro-Yeltsin ones and the army, which supported Yeltsin, began to clash with them. If some sources are to be believed, there were also snipers around the area taking pop shots at civilians rioting. Eventually, as the place got more and more chaotic, Yeltsin had enough, and on October the 4th, 1993, he sent tanks into the middle of Moscow and ordered them to fire on the Supreme Soviet building. Afterwards, soldiers stormed the building, arresting all parliament members. In the aftermath, Yeltsin now realized that he had sort of accidentally arrested most of his opposition. So when it came to writing a new constitution, so you're telling me that I can write literally whatever I want here, and no one's gonna stop me? You would be correct, sir. Oh, okay.
A few minutes later.
I am king, I am emperor, all shall bow before me and kiss my toe. In the new constitution, he officially abolished the Supreme Soviet and replaced it with two new organs, the Federation Council and the State Duma, both of which had little power and were highly subject to the president, Yeltsin. However, due to a humiliation by Chechnya, an oil price crash, and Yeltsin always being completely drunk, he was a very unpopular president by the year 2000. So he made a deal with his prime minister, the one, the only, everyone's favorite political boogeyman, Vladimir Putin. The deal was that Yeltsin would resign and make Putin president. In return, Putin would make Yeltsin exempt from any investigations into corruption. After becoming president, both to gain power and popularity, he went about cracking down on the oligarchs, seizing media companies and other assets, as well as waging a second, and this time successful, war against Chechnya and numerous other actions. Anyways, so now that you know how Putin became a dictator, let's check in on the other key country in this story. Ukraine and... Let's rewind a bit. President Viktor Yanukovych had become quite unpopular as he was viewed as a rather pro-Russian president. Oh, hello. Due to policies such as making Russian the second official language of Ukraine, as well as accusations of censorship. He also began to heavily rely on Russian economic aid. The straw that broke the camel's back was the scrapping of the idea to sign an economic agreement with the EU in favor of one with Russia. The reason provided was that Russia offered a lot more money. On top of that, they did not demand major changes to Ukraine's law, whereas the EU did. Lots of Ukrainians were anything but pleased, and would have much rather taken an objectively worse deal with the EU if it meant having fewer connections to Russia. Fearing the Russians were once more trying to subjugate them through Yanukovych, protests known as the Euromaidan protests began to break out. In response, the Ukrainian parliament began to pass laws prohibiting these protests. As a result, they began to turn more violent. On the 18th of February, a so-called peace offensive was launched in Kiev. When protesters arrived at a police barricade in front of the parliament, they began to brawl. The result being a 3-day-long bloodbath between police and protesters, where 121 would die and thousands more were injured by gunfire, mostly on the side of the protesters. On the 21st of February, an agreement was made with the protesters, where Ukraine would return to the 2004 constitution constitution, and protesters would be released from prison. But having seen their comrades gunned down by police, there were still plenty of protesters who wanted nothing less than to see the removal of Viktor Yanukovych, viewing him as pro-Russian and the cause of all the chaos. Eventually, the riot police decided to leave, since they thought the government would try to blame them for all the violence. And if that happened, they did not want to be there, since protesters had somehow managed to steal 1,200 pistols and Kalashnikovs from the armory during a brief occupation. Seeing their defense leave, the Yanukovych government resigned and left shortly afterwards. Yanukovych himself later boarded a Russian warship from Sevastopol and fled to Russia. In the power vacuum suddenly created, snap elections were held, and a new coalition government was formed. Now, while West Ukraine was generally quite pleased with this new, strongly anti-Russian government, the East was quite the opposite, due to the large Russian minority, or in some cases, majority, such as in Crimea and the Donbass, the latter of which will become very important later. As a result, protests began to break out in the East, due to the new government. In Crimea, protests began as a result of fear that radical pro-Ukrainian groups may arrive to stamp out pro-Russian sentiment, resulting in the creation of a number of people's militias. These Russian militias then began to clash with demonstrations by Crimea's other two ethnicities, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. In response to the growing pro-Russian sentiment and instability, the Ukrainian parliament declared that it would use severe measures to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. While this is all going on, Putin sees this complete chaos and thinks, interesting. There are many reasons why Russia wanted Crimea back. For example, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet is in Sevastopol and was being released from Ukraine. Due to the new strongly anti-Russian government in power, that was very likely to be revoked. No. Another reason is Russia's eternal quest for ports. But you might say, wait, hang on. Russia owns all this. 3 problems. All of this up here is entirely useless for ports, since it's frozen 90% of the time. All of this over here is entirely useless for ports, because it's way too far away from all the industry over here to be of any use. And the port in St. Petersburg, while close to all the industry, and also not frozen over 90% of the time, for a ship to go from St. Petersburg to the rest of the world, it has to pass through all of these countries' naval limits, all of which would be more than happy at any time to just say no. The final reason is that, just look at the map. That's a lot of Russians not in Russia. So how did they actually go about annexing Crimea, I hear you ask? Well, on the 27th of February 2014, anonymous soldiers who became known as Little Green Men, due to their Russian uniforms but lack of any markings indicating that they are officially linked to Russia, began seizing public buildings in Crimea. Yes, you? Sir, why are you invading Crimea? No, I'm not. I'm giving a press conference. During the occupation of the Crimean Parliament building, an emergency session was held, replacing the current Prime Minister with Sergei Anashayov, who just so happened to be a member of the Russian Unity Party. On the 1st of March, he gave Putin control over all military installations in Crimea, in order to, and I quote, ensure peace and tranquility in Crimea. Later, Russian troops, mysterious military men who may or may not have some sort of a connection to the Kremlin, alongside riot police, began to set up a border on the land bridge connecting Crimea to the rest of Ukraine. Shortly after that, Ukrainian TV channels were cut and Russian ones started playing instead. Putin then gave him the approval from his parliament to directly intervene until the situation was normalized. Crimea later declared independence from Ukraine on the 11th of March 2014, afterwards beginning to seize Ukrainian-owned oil wells and other property. In a press conference after the operation, Putin said that only citizens themselves in conditions of free expression of will and their security can determine their future. And how did they go about determining their future through free will and expression? Well, through a vote, naturally. But not one of those silly democratic votes. No. Put it mildly, the vote had some very creative vote counters. Add a few more zeros here. On the 16th of March, a referendum was held, and the vote came to 95% being in favor of joining Russia. However, being heavily criticized. Something just isn't adding up here. The ballot had 2 options: join Russia or go back to the 1992 constitution of Crimea. The only problem being that there are 2 1992 constitutions of Crimea. The first one states that Crimea was independent, but then people quickly realized that the guy they got to write it was an idiot, and the following day changed it to mean Crimea was an independent region within Ukraine. If the Russians wanted to say that Crimea would return to Ukraine, they could have just used the 1998 constitution, putting Crimea clearly within Ukraine. So there practically seemed to be two options: join Russia or become independent, which would practically amount to being a Russian vassal. On top of that, there were also allegations of Russian citizens being able to vote, not just Crimeans. Anyways, no matter how suspicious the election was, and made Crimea an autonomous region within Russia, the West responded through some serious finger-wagging, as well as some sanctions, which did harm the Russian economy quite significantly, but were ultimately futile in stopping any further aggression. Further aggression, such as that which would begin shortly afterwards, which would come to be known as the Donbass War. Okay, yeah, I've had it was recording for